I like to say that the drawings of Gaston Lachaise are the hidden jewels of one of America's leading modernist sculptors. Lachaise is known for his large-scale sculptures, which Karen Wilkin has called sleek Amazons, all breasts, hips, and swelling bellies, who balance on tiny feet or levitate, arms outstretched. But as Philippe de Montebello notes in his foreword of the catalog, sculptors' drawings can be fascinating, as you will see for yourself, and many of you have already seen for yourselves, in the galleries, which are bursting with exuberance on paper. Lachaise was a prodigious draftsman. His output of drawings from his early years in Boston to his last wild years in New York is impressive and closely connected to his growth as a sculptor. He never taught, but he had an assistant, Reuben Nakian. Nakian was also a sculptor, and he said that Lachaise's artistic principle was simplify and amplify, amplification and simplification. This principle is equally evident in his early drawings with their Brancusian simplicity, as it is in his late work, where a seemingly simple but highly evolved line summons great fugues of volume, flesh, and movement. Gilbert Seldes, the author of a profile on Lachaise in the New Yorker magazine in 1931, could have been speaking about any of these when he wrote, "These powerful works by Lachaise have the same flow of movement, the same serene power as his stones." If you look at the drawing in the middle, note that it's on stationery of the Hotel Brevoort, which maybe some of you even passed by. Most of you probably know it. It's on 8th Street and 5th Avenue, and it's where Lachaise used to go a lot, either to stay or to eat, and a lot of artists were there. So I want to say a word about where we are, the studio school. Of course, showing art at an art school is a no-brainer, but this show is interesting for additional reasons. Besides dovetailing the studio school's emphasis on drawing, the selection features a large number of never-before-seen drawings, carefully guarded in the foundation's holdings, and the drawings are making their debut in the historic buildings of the studio school, the site of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's studio and the first Whitney Museum, 1931. Lachaise was closely connected to all iterations of the Whitney. He probably met Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney when he was working for Henry Hudson Kitson in the studio just behind us on McDougal Alley, and Gertrude had her studio on McDougal Alley and slowly conglomerated 4 different buildings to make what you're in now. So that's where Patterson Sims of the Whitney thought they might have first met. But she also collected his work, and he was a young member of the Whitney Studio Club. Basically, they supported artists, and Lachaise was one of them, and Gertrude bought works directly from him. And at the opening of the museum, 2 of his works, at least, were exhibited, and he was included in the Biennales here in 1933 and 34. More importantly, in 1937, 2 years after he died, 79 years ago in April, he was given a retrospective exhibition called Drawings and Small Sculptures, which I didn't know about when we agreed to do this show, but it's really fun to think that the same recessed lights that lit the Whitney's first shows and Lachaise's show of drawings is now lighting the current show. And what's even more interesting, this is the same lobby as you see it today, a photo by Berenice Abbott from 1938, and the review of the 1937 show by Henry McBride. Remarkable Lachaise drawings. What's really interesting is that I've included a label that is on the back of the drawing on the right. It's in our collection. It's just a photograph. We don't have that drawing anymore, but it shows you that Lachaise often repeated his themes, and he drew many of the same. You might think it's the same drawing, and actually that drawing is on view in the galleries, but you can see there are certain details that are different. You can look up close. So Lachaise was an intrinsic part of this neighborhood. These were his stomping grounds. And I have a great cartoon here to show you. It's by Reginald Marsh from 1922. And I've included some details, but so just for fun, this is Zelda Fitzgerald throwing herself into the fountain and their little child. We've got the mayor of New York. It's Heighton, Mayor Heighton. We've got Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, pursued by Robert Winthrop Chandler, who many of you know painted her studio upstairs. We've got Lachaise here, and this here is Washington Mews. The mayor is looking out on McDougal Alley, which is right here. So Lachaise is in the studio at 42 Washington Mews with Paul Manship, who he was working for at that time in 1920. Well, it's depicting him working for Manship. He didn't work for him in 1922 anymore. He bought his paper for drawing in Chinatown, just a little few blocks south of here. And many of the drawings depict burlesque dancers who were at a theater on East Houston Street. So often we see historic places razed for condominiums. What makes this place so special to show art is its past history and dedication to art that emanates from every creaky floorboard and original recessed light. There's something very compelling in the story of an artist's personal studio becoming a studio to support other artists, and then a world-class museum, which is now an art school. So the subject of these drawings, as with his sculptures, is the female nude, whose spirit and proportions were inspired for the most part by his muse, model, and wife, Isabelle Dutto Nagel. Here she is on the rocks in Maine, and an early drawing, which I think go really well together. I can't help but think they aren't connected, but they probably weren't. Now you're wondering, how did they meet? Let's go back to Paris, 1882. Lachaise was born to Mary Barr, a wine merchant, and Jean Lachaise. His claim to fame is designing the woodwork in the Eiffel Tower private apartment. So if you go to the very top of the Eiffel Tower, you'll see Thomas Edison and Gustave Eiffel sitting talking. And if you look really closely, you'll see the carved wood, which is done by Jean Lachaise. He was schooled as an artist in Paris, attending the École Bernard Palissy for applied arts, and then the École des Beaux-Arts. Here's an image of him seated lower right, Indian style. And here's an image from the Beaux-Arts. But he was tired of copying plaster busts. They were dead. He was looking for a living reason to make art. Oops. Around 1903, walking out through the formal gates of the Beaux-Arts, he saw, as he told the story, a majestic woman walking slowly by the bank of the Seine. He then met this woman, Isabelle, who was a beautiful American of French-Canadian descent. She was 10 years older than Lachaise and with a child, who she was overseeing the education of in Paris. Standing about 5'3" or 4", her passport said 5'4", but as I first learned it, people always said she was about 5'2" or 3", maybe. She had long dark hair, ample hips, full breasts, slender legs, beautiful ankles, and exceptional poise. One friend said she walked on the balls of her feet as though she were dancing. Cupid shot his arrow. The two fell in love. They enjoyed poetry and dance. Isabelle was a poet and shared her poems with Lachaise. He later described her as the primary inspiration which awakened my vision and the leading influence that has directed my forces. I refer to this person by the word woman with a capital W. This woman eventually returned home to the United States. So, shortly after, at the age of 23, Lachaise gave up his career in France and went to work at Renée Lalique. Here she is, again. Photographs from Paris. The studio of Jean Aguelou. So we went to work for Renée Lalique, designing jewelry, learning about metalwork. And he made enough money to pay for the boat to take him to follow his wife, his future wife. In America, Lachaise marveled at the dynamic pace of life, the machinery, the Chinese circus, and the women of America, proud in their faith, in their liberation. Having venerated the Venus de Milo, At the Louvre, Lachaise sought to create what he called a new Venus in America. He wrote that America had the soil the most fertile for the continuity of art. While there is no better example of his new Venus than in his sculptures, he also captured her on paper. You can see her in his burlesque dancers, his acrobats, and in the fascinating forms of a woman's back. Lachaise mostly drew to explore a theme or just relax. As A. Hyatt Mayer, who was the curator of prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, wrote in 1932, "The drawings are not sketches for sculpture, not means to an end, but are ends in themselves and exist in their own right." Lachaise was truly tireless. After 12 hours of working for Paul Manship, he would then turn to his own work for 7 or 8 more hours. He was a bull, Edward Warburg wrote, with a ferocious compulsion to work like fury. Some nights, Lachaise drew himself to sleep, dropping the works to the floor in his hotel room. He would sell drawings to meet the week's expenses and create drawings to add to his inventory. The writer M.R. Werner remembered that in New York, Lachaise would go to Chinatown. I told you that already, sorry. But he would make hundreds of drawings and then sell them for small amounts. As he prepared for a drawings exhibition at Rain Galleries, he wrote to Isabelle, "I tried today to find some decent drawing for Rain, but all out of them. I shall go to it tonight drawing hard and find myself with 200 or more good ones ready." During his first years in America, in Boston, Lachaise made a number of lyrical ink drawings. He filled pads of newsprint with his poetic, classical, sometimes erotic visions. His touch is careful, thin, tentative lines define the body, while a thick brush masterfully achieves a perfectly shaped swath of hair draped over a shoulder or a cool shadow on the ground. The captivating sketches are simple and yet conjure an imaginative land of languorous women and men mountains. These are lovely drawings, but they are not yet exuberant. A small, intimate sculpture from this time called Dans la Nuit, made by 1905, has a similar dreamy feel, perhaps illustrating a line from one of Isabelle's poems, "Thus to rest, heart with heart to rest." This theme of the reclining couple was very important to Lachaise, and it was one of the last works he made in his life. He died, and he left a larger version of this sculpture in a form, Bob Spring can tell us better about this, or Jeffrey, but it was a form that needed to be cast immediately in bronze, or it would, or be turned into a plaster to then be cast in bronze, or it would crumble. Maybe it was something that would dry out, and Rockefeller, the silent patron of Lachaise, was called in to save the day, and actually you can see that large version of this Dans la Nuit at Kaiket, Rockefeller's home in Pocantico Hills by Tarrytown, or you can see it in front of the Bruce Museum in Greenwich. I have not found any suggestion anywhere in his notes or letters or papers, but I wonder what he was thinking when he made these haunting, nude, faceless figures. There was a revival of classical dance at the time, so perhaps they are the suppliant maidens of Aeschylus or the Trojan women of Euripides. If one played the music of Gluck, Chopin, or Beethoven, they might come to life in modern dance. Lachaise did see Isadora Duncan dance in Boston in 1909. He was carried away by the emotion of it and wrote to a friend back home, "This good, modest city of Boston plans to prohibit her when she returns because she dances a bit too nude. As for myself, I feel that completely nude would be a beautiful thing too. It's phenomenal how these virtuous and chaste people see nothing but sex." Slightly later ink drawings, more like portraits, depict a woman with a veil and long dark hair. In one, she is wearing black stockings. The features and proportions are Isabelle's, as are those of Nude with a Coat, the sculpture in the lower right. This sculpture was included in the Armory Show of 1913. It was a very important art show that brought European modernism to the Americans. Some people say Americans were already a little bit modern, but it was a very important show. This sculpture was included in it because Lachaise was working for Henry Hudson Kitson at the time, and in walked Gutzen Borglum and Arthur Davies, who were organizing the Armory Show, and they said, "We're looking for a piece by Kitson," and then they left, not finding anything. And he ran after them and he said, "My studio is around the corner," and they took this work. In the catalog, Linda Nochlin mentions the hip shot pose and contrapposto of a later torso. Donald Goodall, who wrote a dissertation on Lachaise, speaks about a woman hovering in balance. I see that even in these early works. Lachaise and Isabelle were often separated, even after they were married in 1917. Isabelle to be near her son, Lachaise to be near his work. Lachaise wrote to Isabelle every day, sometimes twice a day, even from afar. Isabelle was his constant inspiration. "I have been experiencing a great strength of mind, a strength which I know comes from having been near you." Writing about a pastel he made, "I capture you better when you are no longer before me." Scholars like me relish the letters and are glad for their separation, for in them are little nuggets like this one. He's talking to her about her son, Edward, and a difficulty in the relationship, and he advises her to love someone is not to possess them, but to give them total freedom. And I didn't know he would be here, but Bob Spring, the former head of the Modern Art Foundry in Queens, his father cast for Isabelle, and may even have worked with Lachaise at Roman Bronze Works. And his son Jeffrey is now head of the foundry, and they cast bronzes for the Lachaise Foundation from original models that we have. Bob has a theory that because they were so often separated, they never got out of the romantic phase of their affair. These letters are also interesting for the drawings that he includes in them. This is a lovely drawing on the left, chock full of details, which I hope you can see. He showed his loving thoughts, or just to let her know he was thinking of her. So here she is in bed. There's a vase of flowers to one side and a breakfast tray garnished with a cup of, and he describes it, Kuffler's best. I think it's probably coffee. And you can see this sculpture here on the windowsill is something that obviously meant a lot to her that he had done, and it looks a little bit like this sculpture. And he says she's wearing her blue kimono. I hope pink one is coming. He was constantly sending her things. I mean, he was in debt always, and I think part of the reason is because he single-handedly propped up the post office. Every single day they wrote letters, twice a day sometimes, and they were sending each other things. He wrote to her, "You are the goddess I seek to express in all my work." And I think you get that feeling from these drawings. In the exhibition, you'll see this drawing, which is unlike the other drawings. It's kind of a study for a sculpture on the left. It's either done as a study for the female figure of 1917, or I don't actually know in what way it was done, either before or after, but it definitely relates to the sculpture. And you can see that it relates to the body of Isabelle. Another drawing, he writes on the left, "Pas de lettre de toi aujourd'hui," and he's celebrating her. He called her Belle, and there's a letter which talks about why he calls her Belle. Her name is Isabelle, but he describes why Belle, beautiful, is so perfect for her. And here's another one. You can see them embracing in the lower left corner, and then on the right is a great drawing which has a little humor in it. Somebody's bringing her, and I think it's him, a tray with red roses on it, and she's in bed and she writes, she's looking for something on the table, and she says, "Après 55 ans, où sont mes binocles?" Where are my glasses after 55 years? Here's another one. She's lying beside their pond in Georgetown. They bought a home there in about 1922-23, and you can see how it relates to his sculpture. During the 1910s, Lachaise depicts the female figure in a series of crayon drawings. She's mostly svelte, a little voluptuous, sometimes climbing stairs, often holding a veil. What's interesting about these drawings is the geometric delineation of breasts, tummy, pubis, and a simple curve to connote her buttocks. He presents a confident woman proud of her voluptuous body, hardly the boyish silhouette in fashion at the time. I think it's interesting, too, to note that in 1914, Lachaise saw Brancusi's work at Alfred Stieglitz's gallery. And Lachaise loved Brancusi. He said it often, and Brancusi learned of this and actually came to visit Lachaise's studio and was said to have left without saying a word, and we don't really know what that means. But he didn't say he didn't like it. So these are simple drawings, maybe with a touch of amplification. Maybe there's restrained exuberance in these. The grace and poses of these drawings recall the elegant bronze reliefs from this period, which also depict woman in motion, ethereal, pneumatic, with an organic Art Nouveau curve. Again, she holds her head high and has a palpable confidence. Now picture yourself back to 1918, back to a vibrant area in New York City between the world wars. Woodrow Wilson is president. The Armory Show has taken place. Lachaise has his first solo exhibition at the Stéphane Bourgeois Galleries. Women in New York State have just won the right to vote, and the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, would soon allow all women to vote. I think it's important to note all this because his women are becoming more and more exuberant. Reviewing Lachaise's exhibition, the critic Henry McBride wrote, "Mr. Lachaise, being French, has been impressed by our recently enfranchised ladies. He feels, he says, and his work shows that he feels, something extraordinary and powerful in our women. They seem to be energy incarnate." I think this is a good sculpture for that. 1919, so I think what's also interesting about this work is there is a simplicity to it and yet also an amplification. He surely saw this sculpture. It's an Etruscan 5-inch tall ancient sculpture from 500 BC, and it was acquired in 1901 by the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. So therefore, it must have been on view in the first years when Lachaise was in Boston from 1906 to 12. And I just think it's uncanny, the woman walking, the posture. He probably did it on his own, but he surely saw this, and maybe there's a subconscious influence. The other thing is how modern Lachaise's piece looks, but doesn't that Etruscan woman walking also look modern? I think it's good to mention at this point someone who described Isabelle as a woman capable of advancing down 8th Street with the inspiring gait of an empress. Marguerite Zorak, the artist, recalled that Isabelle hosted literary evenings attended by Marston Hartley, Robert Laurent, and the Stedheimer sisters. She held court in her New York apartment, reclining on a sofa in silken harem pants and a turban. In the early 20s, Lachaise focused on the head, mostly the female head. These very minimalist heads, a man and a woman, have clean, crisp, simple lines, and yet all the depth of an ancient Cycladic head or an Egyptian monument. But while they are reminiscent of these ancient works, they have a feeling of modernity, and there are echoes of Modigliani and Brancusi. Next came a series of heads with eyes closed, serene heads. The eyes are closed or slightly closed, a stylish coiffure, and a particularly American pout. Lachaise's drawings were well known to the public. In 1921, a woman's head and bust that looks very much like the one on the left was included in an exhibition at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. The show was called Paintings and Drawings Showing Later Tendencies in Art. Another appeared on the cover of the literary journal Playboy. It is not Hugh Hefner's Playboy. It was a journal of satire published by Egmont Ahrens through the Washington Square Bookshop at 27 West 8th Street between 1919 and 1924. It featured work by Rockwell Kent, Georgia O'Keeffe, and the Zoraks. In an ad from 1919, it described itself as a spiritual adventure dedicated to joyousness in the arts. With weapons of art and satire comes a playboy to fight the fight of the moderns for the work of this, our generation. Finally, another head that was well known to the public is this head, which I saw at the Met today. They don't have a color image on their website, so this is the best I could do. It's red, and red crayon, and it was called The Austere Head Familiar to Every Lover of Modern Art. It was published in the Dial magazine in 1921, and then it was reproduced, and this is a problem because it was reproduced as a collotype, red collotype. It looks exactly like the original, and people are always confusing them, thinking they're real. These heads, too, exude modernity, but at the same time, there's a sense of inner spirituality, reminiscent of the Buddhist heads which Lachaise visited at the Musée Guimet in Paris. In 1925, the Dial magazine, another magazine devoted to literature and the arts, published a snake-like head entitled Caligari. Long neck and staring eyes. The face is perhaps that of Cesare, the somnambulist in Robert, I don't know how to say this, Weine, W-E-I-N-E, silent film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It had its American premiere in New York in April 1921. A letter written by the poet Mary Ann Moore relays that Isabelle saw it 5 times, which means that Lachaise probably saw it. At this time, Lachaise was also sculpting heads. An early example is the granite head on your upper left from the Museum of Modern Art. Later came the heads of his friends. On the right, you'll see Alfred Stieglitz and Georgia O'Keeffe. These were a kind of pair of wedding portraits they made. And, of course, of Isabelle. She inspired the splendidly simple Head of a Woman, 1923, on the lower left, and is unquestionably the subject of the gorgeous nickel-plated head, which is at the Whitney Museum in the bottom middle. Someone once said that Lachaise's favorite word was simple. Maybe it was because his life was so complicated. Here is a drawing of a head, which is surely connected to the sculpture of Elevation, his monumental life-size sculpture. The bust is at the De Young Museum in San Francisco. I thought it made for a nice comparison. And I don't know when he made the head on paper, but because the bust is dated circa 1920, I'm thinking it was after he first cast, well, the discussion of that is very complicated, but dates to be determined. He also made some heads. Can you see that? They're mature heads, and they're slightly later than the early 20s heads, which add definition to the eyes, nose, mouth, and hair, and fill the page with a striking result. She could be a dancer at the burlesque theater. That's probably not Isabelle. And you'll see a lot of African-American women in his art, and I think those might be dancers that he saw. There's one drawing in the show with the word Harlem written on it, and he maybe went to the burlesque theater in Harlem. Lachaise confessed, "I do not know and love the male figure as I do the woman." And yet, he produced a large number of stunning male nudes in stone, bronze, and paper during the late 20s and early 30s. He was engaged at that time in a number of commissions, such as a portrait commissioned by the architect Philip Goodwin. Philip wanted his young friend monumentalized in bronze. He did his 8-foot-tall man, which was exhibited at the newly opened Museum of Modern Art. He made 4 limestone panels for the 6th Avenue facade of Rockefeller Plaza. It's the back of 30 Rock. You can see them if you're standing right in the middle of 6th Avenue. And one of them is devoted to solar power. It's capturing the energy of the sun. And the program was sponsored by this commission of all the heads of all the museums, and Lachaise really balked under the program of it. And Nelson Rockefeller liked Lachaise very much and visited his studio, and because many proponents of Lachaise, like Warburg and Kirstein, kept after Rockefeller to give him commissions, Rockefeller gave him the commission on the lower left, which is above the entrance to 45 Rockefeller Plaza. And he said, do what you like. It's to commemorate the workers of Rockefeller Center, like the tree. He wrote to Isabelle, I have a debauch of work. I'm undressing all my male friends. I'm using the advantage of models as a starting base for this work. These later ink drawings reveal the artist's anguished attempts to capture the male bust. He must retrain his pen, so accustomed to rendering the ample female breast, to capture a muscular but breastless chest. That's my explanation for these breasts that are here. Although occasionally Lachaise did combine, he does androgynous figures or combines male and female elements. In the head on the lower right, his zealous attention to the facial features yields a misaligned mouth, which combined with a leaning head conveys a sense of inner torment, the existential agony of the heroic search for truth, perhaps of creation itself, recalls James Lord's story of sitting for his portrait by Giacometti. Could this drawing by Lachaise be connected to a portrait of Lincoln Kirstein or Edward Warburg? As Hyatt Mayer aptly observed, in a sense, every figure of Lachaise's is a portrait, an individual struggling against a particular fate. He elaborates, comparing Lachaise and Rouault, who strike at the heart of human tragedy, Rouault through the tragic persistence of the spirit, and Lachaise through the no less tragic exaltation of the flesh. Lachaise's own expressive self-portrait on Brevoort Hotel stationery reveals a similar intensity and serves as an illustration of Cummings' description of him. Dark, unruly hair falling over his brow, his alive and brooding eyes, his scowl and sullen mouth. Marston Hartley also described Lachaise. Lachaise was a big man of better than medium height, dark eyes, dark flowing hair, and an elemental, animalistic burning in him. He was alive with passion for art and the pure expression of it. He was inordinately simple as well. I wanted to show you this work. It's called Satyr. It's from the Wetherspoon Art Museum, and it doesn't seem to be related to a commission. Rather, it shows Lachaise in full control and enjoying the depiction of his subject, a seated male nude with wild, stylized hair, one leg tucked beneath him, and holding between his feminine right forefinger and thumb a veil. In this drawing, Lachaise has merged elements of his male and female subjects. The burlesque theater was perhaps the theme which afforded Lachaise the most freedom throughout his career as a draftsman. Here was, in effect, the ultimate liberation of the female body. He would go with his friend E.E. Cummings to performances at Minsky's National Winter Garden. The stage was on the roof of an old theater on East Houston Street, reached by elevators, and some men joked that they felt they were going up to heaven because the theater was on the top floor. It was a runway lighted from beneath, projected into the audience, and on it the girls paraded. The audience, at least by 1926, included poets, artists, upper-class gentlemen. I know at least a few of you in the audience will be interested to know that for the 1923-24 season, Billy Minsky sent free tickets to the Racquet and Tennis Club, the Harvard Club, and other uptown organizations. He had hopes of attracting high-class customers. Lachaise's quick and sensitive pen captures the effusive eruptions and myriad poses of the euphoric dancing bodies. He focuses on the details from the performance, the breasts, the headdress, the finger holding the veil, and he embellishes these details, conjuring the movement and the rhythms and gestures of the burlesque. On some drawings, he's written the words glory or faith, and on this one on the left, Harlem. Scrawled on another, I am sensing again. Lachaise's use of a veil does more to accentuate than hide their nudity. One can feel the artist's excitement and passion as he celebrates what Hart Crane, in his poem about the burlesque, called outspoken buttocks. Several works have holes. This work has a hole, a couple of holes. You can see them here and here. The pen is making the holes. And they really do possess what Cummings called the virtue of being intensely alive. That full quote is to come. Is there not a similarity between the fervent postures of his nudes and the furies, bacchantes, and maenads, the orgiastic maenads of ancient Greece? Again, the modern is not so modern, it's old. Lachaise put his whole self into his drawings. All art is a confession, he said. One can conceal nothing of one's weakness. Here's another comparison with some dancing burlesque figures. And looking closely, you can see evidence of footprints, maybe one of those drawing sprees where he drew himself to sleep and littered the floor with drawings, which Isabelle would then come and pick up and have him sign. Seated Woman of about 1929 to 30 is a great example of the artist's use of amplification and simplification. One contour line summons the legs and the body, and then he uses ink to call your attention to the areas he doesn't want you to miss. Lachaise relishes the enormous forms of the heavier dancers of the burlesque. He amplifies and exaggerates the shapes still further while rendering them elementary and light by a single contour line. His sure, fluid line amplifies breasts, hips, and buttocks, so they are unrealistic and yet utterly convincing. Do they not have a touch of magic realism? Everything about dancing nude on the right is realistically drawn, except for her breast, thrown over her shoulder like a scarf. In this dancing woman on the right, he magnifies the nipples, which have a life and shape of their own, independent of the body. For all their mass, they seem to lift the dancer. Their power radiates out through the dancer's breasts, through her fingers, and up through her headdress. Lincoln Kirstein mentions Lachaise's gifts of imaginative metamorphosis. This energetic drawing may have its counterpart in sculpture, and you can notice her fingers just indicated with lines. And if you go in the galleries and look at the little sculpture on the left, you'll see that her fingers, too, are holding her breasts. This work on the lower left is a little hard to see, but it's obviously the same subject, maybe a little bit earlier, but it's signed 1933, bien amicalement, to G.L.K. Morris. George L.K. Morris was an artist, and there's a house, museum, and studio devoted to him in Lenox, Massachusetts. So I'm just going to go back to this sculpture of burlesque, which you see on the right, and give you the full quote of Cummings. He wrote a review of the burlesque theater in 1925, December. It's called You Aren't Mad, Am I? Being Certain Observations, Modern Art of Burlesque. So, to sum up, the creations of the National Winter Garden possess, in common with the sculpture of Gaston Lachaise, the painting of John Marin, and the music of Igor Stravinsky, the virtue of being intensely alive. I'm not going to talk about these just yet, but I want to mention that in that same year, 1933, Eddie Warburg organized a show of drawings by sculptors at the Museum of Modern Art. That drawing with the enlarged nipples could have been one of the ones that Lachaise was writing to Isabelle that he was preparing for the show. The show included works by Brancusi, Epstein, Mayol, Noguchi, and others. Lachaise conveyed an unofficial review to Isabelle in a letter, detailing the works by different artists and casting them as unique, good, fine, mediocre, or no good and empty. I won't say which artist you can do the research and find out. But I think that nobody would accuse his drawing of being empty, and it's definitely unique. I just have to go back to this drawing because in the book, somebody left a comment of the show, and the show is called Exuberance on Paper, and they wrote, "Exuberance on paper, ? Protuberance on paper." I thought that was clever. These unconventional images, with all their poses, are grounded in a mastery of the mechanics of the human body. These two skeletons dancing we found, I'd never seen them before, but for the show I found them and thought they would be interesting, especially for art students. And one of the images, which is in the catalog, shows that he knows exactly which muscle is where. He's identified them all, and the gastrocnemius in the calf, and you don't know it from looking at his drawings, but he's actually knows exactly which muscle connects to which tendon, and it seems simple, but he has an understanding of the engineering of the human muscles, bones, and joints, and the knowledge of that bolsters and conveys the frenetic energy of human movement and the primordial life force that you feel in his drawings. With his swift, sure line, he freezes human movement, consigning to paper the expressive breast with its squiggle of a nipple, a curl of a line which in other places can signify a belly button, a twist in fabric, or a bony hip. The result, what Cummings called form which completely expresses itself, that perfectly tactilizes the beholder as an electric machine which, being grasped, will not let the hand go. It's hard to fathom that Lachaise was almost let go from drawing school almost let go from the École Bernard Palissy for his poor drawing skills. He was constantly reaching for greater potential for expression. Cummings visited his studio in 1931 and said, "It is good to see someone still alive. In France, they repeat themselves helplessly. Picasso now is an old priest." As Lachaise himself knew, the artist has to go to the soil again and again to be invigorated. He said this in an interview with a reporter, the New York Herald. And the reporter describes his interview with Lachaise. He picked up an 8-inch figurine of a woman with arms wide outstretched in an attitude of prayer. Lachaise assured the visitor the widely outstretched objects were not arms, but breasts. He called it his woman with praying breasts. Michael Kimmelman describes Lachaise's sculptures as so consuming that he literally turned that body inside out. The work on the lower right is an acrobat woman, contortionist. And as Virginia Budney has said, the woman's piston-like posture and her explosive forms, her sphinx-like expression, conveys a sense of a stillness at the center of a storm. So I really want you guys to look around this sculpture and find her head, because she's contorted and turned inside out, and it's a beautiful, very abstract, very modern sculpture for 1934-ish. Lachaise produced some drawings that relate to his sculpture, as I've shown you. And this drawing on the lower right is in the exhibition, and at first I didn't think it related to any sculpture. I thought it was something that he was planning to make and never did, but I think that it relates to the work on the top, which is in the Harvard Art Museums, and this work in the Foundation's possession on the left. His drawings maybe don't go as far as his sculptures, maybe they can't, because they're two-dimensional, but they are assuredly anti-classical and most potent. Part of what makes them so potent is his interest in the art of many different cultures. He admired Egyptian art and the dances and scenes of loving and destructive gods represented on Hindu temple friezes. These are Cambodian dancers. He liked Southeast Asian art. Hyatt Mayer wrote that Lachaise's nudes were not laden with grossness, but as buoyant as a Gupta sculpture or the frescoes at Ajanta. Lisa Messenger, writing for the Met, finds a parallel between Lachaise's sculpture, between Lachaise's drawing style and the Neo-Assyrian reliefs at the palace of King Ashur-nasir-pal II. He reigned 883 BC. She mentioned that because the same year that the drawing she was writing about was acquired by the Met, they had this work. They acquired the work of Ashur-nasir-pal. But what I think is really interesting, because Lachaise's drawing style was surely established by that point, is that the Boston Museum of Fine Arts acquired in 1881 this relief on the right, which I actually just saw recently, and I didn't realize that there was any connection to it. He distilled all these influences into a style all his own, which celebrates the buoyancy and rudimentary beauty of the human body, whether it's defying gravity in levitation or embracing it in repose. Lachaise certainly had his supporters. In 1920, a critic referred to a group of serious thinkers from Greenwich Village who regard Mr. Lachaise as greater than Michelangelo himself. But life is life, and so he had his detractors too. In response to Lachaise's 1918 exhibition, the sculptor Daniel Chester French shook with rage, calling the work an atrocity. He deplored Lachaise's formula, an ugly, fleshy type. This reminds me of John Ruskin's response to his own wife when he finally saw her on their first night of being married, because he had seen Renaissance art for so long where they're never depicted realistically. So anyway, if you know that story, it's funny. As you have seen, Lachaise did not draw for others. He drew for himself. He drew for Isabelle. Joseph Stella has a great story. He said, Lachaise relayed the story to Isabelle, and he said, Joseph Stella said, how about you and me, how about we form a group? And he said to Isabelle, you know me on this. You and me, that's the group. The innumerable drawings he made, a sampling of which you can see in the galleries, evidence what for Lachaise was a necessary, energizing, almost hypnotic exercise, giving tangible form to his creative visions. There is something about them which provides a balm. Gilbert Seldes called it a slow arrow of beauty, vigorously expressing something of a civilization of which speed seems to be the god. I'm just going to say it again because it's so nice and there's so much in it. Gilbert Seldes, a slow arrow of beauty, vigorously expressing something of a civilization of which speed seems to be the god. Lachaise's drawings, like his sculptures, are both new and timeless. They are exuberant. As Cummings observed, we find nothing archaic, nothing modern, nothing unexperienced. Everywhere we find ourselves conjugated by a mind which feels freely. The drawings shed light on the artist's creative imagination and his progression as a modern artist. From his early attempts to convey emotion through simplicity to his later amplifications of the body, the drawings chart Lachaise's development in his quest for new forms and a unique modern language. May his works, as Thomas Hess forecast in 1947, easily outlive our tentative appreciations, our tributes, and our skyscrapers. If I can just make a quick pitch that many of the works in the galleries are for sale and they are priced well below market with the hope that they will sell, and your purchase of one will benefit two nonprofit organizations serving artists. Thank you.